to suggest that what Mason has said about Chester Creek applies to the entire state of Alaska. It is very unfortunate that this symposium is being held now when it should have been held with numerous follow-ups 10 years ago, so that we could have had some input before we were locked in concrete and land ownerships in Alaska. This was possible 10 years ago in Alaska because so much of the land at that time was owned by one owner, the federal government, and basically under one manager, the Bureau of Land Management. We have to consider that with ownerships, and diverse ownerships of any kind, that the ownership of various parcels of land provides for many different managements. And when you get into many different managements, land management becomes severely constricted. And as we look at this map over here, and we're talking in a watershed symposium, let's keep in mind what we're looking at in that map is a whole bunch of straight lines. And straight lines are much easier for the surveyor to put on a map and to describe. So we're not looking at a watershed map there. Here in Alaska, we still do not have much of an inventory of the land. Over in the Land Use Commission, the people are breaking their backs trying to provide a little information. And the brush that they're using to provide it is very broad. And they're getting the information from what has been published, when 90% of the data that is known about the state of Alaska, particularly the physical and biological, is still in the notebooks of the investigator who actually walked the lands. We still do not have any agreement on the types of management that best fits a northern country. We're pecking around the edges of it, but we have yet to find a management that fits, unless we like Chester Creek's management. Each owner, and by owner, I mean each federal agency, each state agency, each local agency, plus the private sector, and here we have in Alaska now many private ownerships, is more interested in getting his land and getting it under his control than he is in the management of the lands, be they defined by watersheds or straight lines on a map. Each owner is more worried about how the adjoining managements affect him than in how his management will affect the surrounding lands or the total land picture. And in that regard, we can take a look at Secretary Morton's bills, in which he has defined some 83 million acres of D2 lands for various things, and then an additional 98 million acres surrounding, where the land ownerships and land managements will affect the 83 million acres. Nothing in the bill, to my knowledge, talks about how the 83 million acres will affect the other 98 million. And I mention it only because here this is a recent item, and one that the public is well aware of. But this is not the first time, it's not the last time that something of that nature will occur. It is what everyone does. We're always worried about what affects us, not how we affect others. As a result of this rush towards ownership, proper management suffers, and when management suffers, environmental considerations receive very short and cursory treatment. This applies to all levels of government. These comments may not appear to paint too rosy a picture. However, before we ever develop a management program, let alone a comprehensive management program, we must look the situation squarely in the face. Hopefully we will do that during this symposium. The public expects that their public administrators will do this. And unfortunately, often, as a path of least resistance, we have let our public down. And after all, they are the ones that pay the bill. To obtain watershed management, there must be cooperation between the owners involved, and they must have sufficient flexibility to allow for cooperative management. I know of no level of government that has much flexibility or that is willing to use any of the flexibility that they may have. And as a result, today we have neither the cooperation nor the flexibility, and it is up to the public administrators to try to see that these are developed. We have the developmental-oriented groups and the conservation-oriented groups who are not cooperating towards a desired goal. And in that regard, they both have the potential to commit mutual suicide. Unfortunately, the implementation, although certainly not the intent of the National Environmental Policy Act, fosters this non-cooperation by bringing the courts into the picture every step of the way. In other words, instead of cooperation, we're all caught in an adversary position. Another item that is very often overlooked is that we have made promises to the native population of the state of Alaska. We have given them lands with the implied thought, if not word, that they can develop these lands so as to provide the things that they want, such as clean water, sewage disposal, school, medical facilities, and so on. At the same time, we have implied that they can continue a subsistence economy, such as their grandfathers enjoyed, while still enjoying these facilities. And I think that here, as public administrators, we have led the native people down the primrose path of disillusionment, because those who have lived out in the villages know that you severely compromise subsistence economies when you want a school, that you severely compromise subsistence economies when you want medical facilities, and you end up with small, remote, urban areas with all the problems of the urban area of Anchorage and absolutely zero tax base to take care of any of these problems. We have to keep in mind that merely by letting a person see a Sears and Roebuck catalog, he has been marred and he can never again be the same. This was one of the things that was said about China, the turn of the century. God, if they ever become educated and find out what they're missing, the world will never be able to supply the demand that they will have. Another thing that we should keep in mind is, what is the definition of subsistence? And if we want to say living off the land, in Alaska we should consider that there is not very much of an agricultural potential in many of the areas in which some of the native peoples live. Many of the native communities want transportation facilities. Essentially transportation facilities that they can use but that tourists and sports hunters cannot use. Some people refer to these as one-way roads. This doesn't seem practical. Nor does it seem practical to allow them for the development of an economic base that is implied in the land claim settlement. I think that we have to go ahead and quit talking about modes of transportation unless we look further and consider the economics involved in various modes of transportation. It is not fair for the government or the academic community to talk about ideals high in the sky and to not put a dollar sign on them, because that is the grease with which our present day life and economy is smooth. I think that it's unfair for us to talk about 400 houses for the city of Barrow to be funded by federal government sources, to be provided by running water and departing sewage like down south, when in 1971 the actual engineering estimate was $17,492,000. Considering that that was probably at least 50% under, let's just call it $18 million. That is $45,000 per hookup on a $12,000 house. And how does a subsistence economy pay for that? How does a subsistence economy operate it? We've heard this morning Mayor Roderick talk about some problems of water supply for the city of Anchorage. And he tossed in a new figure of $36 million, and it slid by rapidly. However, my ears perked up, because I get caught in defending some of these things, at least the state aspect of them, in the legislature. But let's take a look at $36 million. There's already been an investment in water in the Anchorage area, but depending upon how many people that will serve, say that we consider 50,000. There we're talking about $750 per person. Or let's take a look at the sewage treatment plant here. $40 million, something on the order of maybe 50,000 people served. Here, another 800 or maybe 1,000 if you consider that they did have a couple sewage lines before. And in Anchorage, or in Juneau rather, we have a contract out now, and I don't mean that type of contract, but there is a contract for $8.5 million to provide sewage services. This is considering they already have some lines in for 7,000 people. That's $1,200 per capita. And if you have a family of 6, we're talking $7,000. Actually, people are squealing now about their sewage assessments, when in the past the federal and state government have been paying 75% of the cost, and now 87.5% of the cost. However, we have to watch it, because the federal government is going into revenue sharing and letting the local people who know best pick up some of their local problems. And this year, the federal government said that water and solid waste were local problems. Well, if it's a local problem as to how to get it into the house, may not be too long before it's a local problem as to how to get it out. We're going to have to face reality, including economic reality, before we can develop management systems for anything, including watershed management. Part of this reality is that we're going to have to develop cooperative and flexible agreements between and among landowners or land custodians acting as owners before we can get very far along the road in the development of watershed management. Thank you.
Thank you. Very inspiring thoughts. The next speaker is Chester Zenone.
Thank you, Dr. Selkregg. I'd like to echo Commissioner Brewer's comment about being the last on the program. Looks like just about everything you plan to say has been said already, but I'll try to be brief and not elaborate too much on some of the points. It seems like he and I had ESP on preparing parts of our written statements. Our organization, the Alaska Conservation Society, supports the comprehensive type studies and planning that have been discussed by many of the people on this panel this morning. Of course, this shouldn't be a too surprising statement to make because I guess it'd be almost un-American to be against comprehensive planning today. So I would, however, modify that statement to mean that we'd support the type of planning that was truly comprehensive, one that considered all resources and aspects of the land, the non-priceable and non-economic ones, quality of life, if you will, such as free-running rivers or natural forests, as well as the economic ones, hydropower dams, petroleum, minerals, and timber. The land use plan for watershed management must consider that hydrologic entity as a unit and not as management subunits created by drawing on the map the regular straight boundaries Commissioner Brewer referred to, the straight boundaries of transportation corridors or of village, city, borough, or state holdings. Natural physical processes don't honor such political boundaries, and I dare anyone in this audience to find a straight line ridgetop or other geometric design natural feature that separates adjacent watersheds or drainage areas. Once again, if we look at the map of existing land and existing use, proposed land ownership in Alaska, and we have there superimposed on it the outlines of the major river drainage basins, I'm sure we see the great challenge to watershed managers and other decision makers. And again, if we had the similar maps of the local anchorage area, we'd see the same challenge in regard to our creeks, Chester Creek, Campbell Creek, and Chip Creek. Any watershed management plan must fully assess the effects of the proposed land uses on the people and water and other natural resources in that area, particularly as they affect long-range usage. Watershed managers must, and I'm sure they do, acknowledge that Alaska will shortly experience unprecedented population growth and that the water and other natural resources that seem adequate today will soon be in short supply. In addition to assuring adequate quantities of water, such plans must direct the manner of any urban, suburban, rural, commercial, industrial, or transportation route development in a way that will ensure protection of the overall quality of that water for any and all anticipated uses. Those of us who call ourselves conservationists, and I'm sure most of those who wouldn't dare be associated with that term, would like to see our watersheds managed on a pollution-free basis. We realize this is probably not entirely possible, even if we demanded only the necessities of life, because of our presently large and ever-increasing population. Yet we believe we have the right to experience large areas of our outdoor environment free of pollution, that we should be able to use the water in that environment without fear of endangering our health. And when we get right down to it, all the arguments regarding subsistence-type living or the allocation of water, forestry, fish and wildlife resources would be meaningless if there's no natural habitat in which those resources can survive, thrive, and replenish themselves. To assist in formulation of comprehensive watershed management plans, the basic physical data on our Alaskan environment, as well as the cultural and social data, and the analysis and interpretations of those data are available in publications of government agencies and university and private research groups. All this available information must be used, realizing that to be effective, it must be utilized at the right time and by the right people. And I might emphasize that term, by the right people. We just had a two-day state conservation meeting here in Alaska, here in Anchorage, and someone brought up the fact that a lot of decisions aren't really made objectively on the basis of the data, but on the basis of value consideration, and the values they're based on are the values of the people making those decisions. So I'd emphasize this about the right people making the decisions. And back to a point that I believe Mr. Wade brought up, in addition to knowing what is on the land physically, it's important in the planning process to find out what the people, those who have to live with the plan, really want for their land. Because without their input, no land use plan can ever hope to be effective. Finally, and most importantly, I think to the theme of this symposium, although the planning process is never really completed, but is a continuous process of planning and decision making, it must be put into action and not into our filing cabinets. If we just dust off some of the comprehensive and far-looking plans that are already on our shelves and put them into action, I think we might go a long way to putting water resources management and other types of management out of the catch-up game. They may have to be updated, but most of them are basically good. And these plans must not be viewed, as they often seem to be, as something to do while an area is developing, oblivious to the planning process. In summary, through the full and wise utilization of available information on our environment, including the watershed environment, implementation of programs to obtain data that are lacking, finding out during the planning process what the people who will be affected by our plan want for their land, things that the Land Use Planning Commission and its resource planning team are doing, and especially by putting into action those comprehensive plans that are developed through use of that information. The great step will be taken toward fulfillment of the Society's objectives to secure the wise use and protection of all the natural resources of Alaska. So when the question is posed, as the title of this seminar does, after the Land Use Planning Commission what, I would say put into effect the plans that that Land Use Planning Commission have made. Thank you.
Thank you, Walt. Ladies and gentlemen, Walt mentioned that our students are traveling around the field quite a lot, and more frequently now in pairs, I think, because since the women's rights movement has gained momentum, we do have fair distribution of either sex among our students. Today's panel, or this afternoon's panel, is to focus on fish and game management, or fish and wildlife management, with the emphasis on cooperation between state, federal, and private interests. You might have noticed that I'm director of the Cooperative Wildlife Research Unit, and maybe that's why Walt suggested me for the panel, because cooperative implies that we do have some basis for understanding the need for cooperation. But I did look up in the dictionary the meaning of the word cooperate, and it says to operate together. And if you look at this map over here showing the distribution of lands presently and in the immediate future in Alaska between various interests, it looks like someone has operated on the state of Alaska, and as sort of a patchwork pattern has resulted. Some of the panelists this morning referred to the straight lines associated with this patchwork panel, or patterning rather. And I think most of you who are at all familiar with fish and wildlife understand that they do not recognize straight lines, and the habitat needs and requirements and movement patterns of fish and wildlife resources tend to completely ignore man's imposed boundaries. I'd like to introduce the panel this afternoon, members of the panel. See, on my left, my extreme left, is Mr. Clark Engel, President of the Alaska Professional Hunters Association. Mr. Russell Dunn, next to him, is a member of Trout Unlimited. Mr. Jim Brooks is Commissioner of the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. Mr. Jim Reardon, next to me here on my left, is a member of the Alaska Board of Fish and Game, the state Fish and Game Regulatory Board. And on my extreme right is Mr. Joe Iovino, Chief of Systems and Planning Activity for the Bureau of Sport, Fisheries, and Wildlife, located here in Fairbanks, but for the area, in Anchorage, pardon me. And Mr. William Schoenberg, President of the Isaac Walton League, as the remaining member of the panel. I think that that fish and wildlife are frequently taken for granted in Alaska. We hear a lot of talk about the potential of the development of Alaska's resources and the millions of dollars involved in oil, timber, and other developments. Whereas, except perhaps in the case of commercial fisheries, there's very little recognition of the real value of fish and wildlife resources to the state of Alaska. The fish and wildlife resources do represent a multi-million-dollar industry or a multi-million-dollar economy to the state of Alaska. That is right here and now. The money that's circulated in the state, brought into the state and circulated within the state as a result of these resources, tends to be the kind of money that economists think is very beneficial to society because it passes through many hands. Many people benefit from each dollar that flows in this particular economy. This is more true than is the case of other types of extractive resources, such as, for example, oil. There are also other industries that you might say are wildlife related, such as tourism and outdoor recreation, which many people, again, derive benefit from, and these are dependent upon the well-being of fish and wildlife resources. Transportation, of course, and services related to these are extremely important. But I think perhaps the greatest value of fish and wildlife resources to Alaska is not in its dollar value. And in this respect, I think I disagree with Commissioner Brewer's emphasis that we have to use dollars if we're going to grease the skids of our economic system. I think that the real value of fish and wildlife resources to Alaska are that they are one of the major bases for a lifestyle that is unique to Alaska. You can't put a dollar value on this. Some time ago, our Wildlife Research Unit conducted a questionnaire survey to try to get a feeling from the public as to what it was that brought them to Alaska and kept them here. And we found that the majority of the people felt that the fish and wildlife resources and what they meant in the way of outdoor recreation and their particular lifestyle was one of the major reasons why they were in Alaska. And this goes beyond then just subsistence hunting or sport hunting and recreation. It's a reason for being here, the opportunities that are available, and not necessarily the meat in the locker or the meat in the pot. These are nevertheless important. Well, fish and wildlife resources are renewable resources, and I think again we tend to take for granted that renewable resources will come back year after year. They'll always be there. for their harvest or utilization. But I think that it should be obvious that renewable resources will only be available in the future if both the basic population stocks are protected and maintained, as well as the habitat which these populations are dependent upon is maintained. In the case of commercial fisheries, there have been problems of overexploitation and perhaps less need for concern about the habitat. In fact, in Alaska in general, habitat has not been a real wildlife management or fisheries management problem, although increasingly in the future, I think it will be. Fish and wildlife habitat is generally not compatible with industrial development. Well, the land and the waters that are associated with it are being divided to serve or to meet multiple interests of the people. Fish and wildlife live in these waters and on these lands, and as I mentioned earlier, they do not recognize the boundaries that man has imposed on the land areas. So this then leads to the basic concern of the panel this afternoon, and that is to deal with the problem of how we're going to manage fish and wildlife resources on on lands serving the multiple interests of the people, and in many cases separately serving the multiple interests of the people, and at the same time maintain the well-being and continued productivity of the fish and wildlife resources in such a state that Alaskans and other people that are dependent or use them will have them available to them in the future. I'd like to call on the panel members in the order that they're listed here in the agenda, just for convenience sake. And so I'd like to ask Mr. Joe Iovino to say a few words now.